It's the week ending Saturday the 16th of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the release of the first major report into the UK's pandemic response, concluding Britain did not lock down soon enough, the murder of 5 people with a bow and arrow on the streets of Norway, and Star Trek star William Shatner, aged 90, becoming the oldest person ever to go into space. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining us today from the week's digital team is Sorcha Bradley, and we welcome back freelancers Abdulwahab Tahhan, and from a daily history podcast called The Retrospectors, which I've heard is great, it's Arion McNicoll. Abdul, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The dictator is back by popular demand.
2 Parisian townhouses, a castle, vast office space in Lyon, and even a stud farm. The list of Rifat al-Assad's French assets was long. So whose money paid for it all? His crimes spanned the period between 1984 and 2016 and include aggravated tax fraud as well as misappropriation of Syrian funds.
France 24 reporting on the crimes committed by Rifat al-Assad earlier this year. Abdul, who is Rifat al-Assad and why is his name in the spotlight now?
Rifat al-Assad is the uncle of the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad. He left Syria in 1984 after a failed coup against his brother, Assad's father, and he has been living in Paris, in France and Spain ever since. Now he's been charged by the French authorities for cases of fraud and money laundering. So in order to avoid going to jail for 4 years, he decided to go back home to Syria with permission from his nephew.
I was going to say, it's not just a case of he decided to, is it? When they exiled him, Abdul, they made it very, very clear, the al-Assads, that he was not welcome back in Syria, and yet here he is.
Well, it was alleged that in 1984, when he went into self-exile after a failed coup, he had an agreement with his brother Assad that, give me all the money and I would leave you in peace. And Assad did not have enough money, so he went to Libya and borrowed money from Libya. And the allegation also go in Syria that there were a lot of people carrying money, cash money, from the central bank to the airport, and there were not enough people and not enough money. So all this money that is being now confiscated by the French and Spanish authority is actually Syrian people's money. Again, in order to avoid jail, he decided to come back home, but again, with the blessing of his nephew now, who's in power.
I mean, that goes to show, doesn't it, Sorcha, just how ensconced Bashar al-Assad obviously does feel now, given everything that happened during the war and efforts to displace him, that he is willing to welcome back the man who tried to overthrow him.
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that he's willing to let, a rival does show that he feels insurmountable with the various international backers that his regime does have, particularly Iran and Russia. So I think Assad feels that his position is safe enough that he can welcome back rivals into the country.
And maybe he's got a soft spot after all, Sorcha. That's the question I wouldn't dare put to Abdul, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, potentially. Obviously, he's 84 now. He's advancing in his years, and perhaps Assad feels the threat has gone and he's willing to welcome him back because of that.
Arion, I suppose the bigger story, in a way, is that it is possible to live in exile for partly organising a coup, but partly also committing crimes against humanity, and find refuge in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Rifat al-Assad's conviction for buying an estimated 90 million worth of property, including dozens of flats around Paris and stables and a chateau, all with embezzled Syrian state funds, as Abdul mentioned, has overtones of, like, Al Capone being convicted of tax evasion. This was the guy who was known as the Butcher of Hama for his reported role in brutally putting down an uprising in 1982 that was estimated to have killed about 20,000 people. So, the fact that he's been convicted of this much lesser thing does seem indicative of a sort of failure of European responsibility to bring to justice people who they have been housing. And I read a Times article which quoted a Syrian activist, Majid Abdel Noor, who said, that France seems to have let him go just to get rid of the embarrassment of providing shelter to a war criminal and at the same time to benefit from his money. And there's no doubt that seizing all of that cash seems like a nice thing to have in your coffers. Plus, also, you no longer have to deal with the threat of this guy in your backyard.
And Abdul, these crimes weren't committed all that long ago in Syrian people's memory. How do you think in Syria, generally, the public will take this news?
Oh, little did we know that back in 2011, when we started this revolution against Assad, that we would be reuniting Assad family members in 2021. I mean, he spent 37 years back in France, couldn't integrate, couldn't speak French until now. He comes back speaking Arabic. It's estimated that at least 9 million people have become refugees in order for one guy to come back. So the Syrian community outside Syria is very frustrated that, this guy allegedly committed massacres, nicknamed him the Butcher of Hama, and he's back now in Syria, laughing and having fun and enjoying living in palaces where the Syrian people are struggling to get gas and petrol and food. Are people happy? I don't think so. Did we expect this? Definitely not. But it is what it is. This is the rehabilitation of Assad. There was an article in the Newsweek that Assad is back in world stage and he has won. And I kind of totally agree with that. Assad has won, but Syria has lost in this sense.
And for Europeans sort of just going about our business, it does shed a light, this story, doesn't it, on who owns what. I mean, we hear, don't we, about, often Russian tycoons sort of offloading money, offshoring their money into London and Cyprus and places like that. I mean, in this case, al-Assad, it turned out, owned hundreds of properties around Marbella and Porti Banús. I mean, that's where I had my honeymoon. I might have parked my car on my honeymoon in a garage that was bought with money that had been siphoned out of Syria. Do you think we care enough about it? We look into it enough?
I think this story will chime, particularly with people who have been following the Pandora Papers story. There is an increasing interest, I think, especially in the media, of kind of looking into these networks of offshore wealth, where they come from. And, I'm glad to see an increased interest in that.
Well, it's not only the Syrian, it's obvious in the Pandora paper, it's not only the Syrian criminals who have a network in Europe, but also head states and previous head states. We've got the Jordanian king, he's got tens of millions in the UK. And I wonder if Europeans really pay attention to this, because these people need to pay taxes. We need to tax these people. I cannot believe that I'm paying more taxes than Rafat Assad was paying taxes in France. This is just mind-boggling, and this really annoys me so much.
I read this really interesting article in The National, which is a Dubai-based paper, about how loads of Syrians who fled the country have found themselves living in places across Europe that are also housing their former oppressors, sometimes even in the same neighborhood as them. And they told the story of a woman called Salwa al-Homsi, who was just 24 when she was jailed by Syrian intelligence agents in Aleppo in 2012 for protesting against the government. After she got out of prison, she fled to Germany, but soon found that one of her friends, also in Germany, was living on literally the same street as a former member of Shabiha, which is Syria's state-sponsored militia group. And so I think that there's an accountability question of Europeans looking into these sorts of questions. And there are activists from Syria who are trying to help find those people who used to operate within the regime and bring them to justice. But I think that accountability has to be shared among the community that they've come to live with as well.
Yeah, because there's a cost, isn't there, to policing these people. Let's just talk about people in exile generally. The thing about someone who's in exile is that they become someone else's problem, don't they? So the original country doesn't have to look after them anymore, but they are still a problem for someone else, but not until they break the law. Like, it would perhaps be unreasonable for the French or the Spanish police to spend millions of euros tracking al-Assad, going about business which is legitimate in that country, just because they know he was up to dirty tricks in the country he's been ejected from.
I mean, I am interested in that. I'm particularly interested in the fact that the International Criminal Court hasn't brought proceedings against Rifat al-Assad. Why was it that he was being tried just for this comparatively minor crime when there was much more major stuff that we know about? And why has he been released in this way back to his homeland, where he is, as Abdul says, just going to live out his life in a comparatively cushy way? I think there's real questions to answer, which I presume is why Abdul brought this story to us today.
Yeah, Rafat al-Assad didn't go to prison because of his poor health. But if you see his Instagram post, he's dancing, he's jumping, he's with people, eating and doing everything.
Sorry, when you say if you see his Instagram...
Yes,
he's like 88, isn't he, or something?
Well, he's not on...
Does he have an Instagram?
He's got 16 children, and one of his children is posting Instagram stories and photos of his father, Right,
featuring him.
Yes.
Okay, but he's not a big grabber.
No, he's not. But again, this is a European problem. Like, when asylum seekers apply to become refugees, they are asked how much money you got, and where you got this money. And if someone has a phone, they will ask them, where did you get this phone and stuff? So someone coming to the country from another country with millions and millions of euros, and the authorities say, yep, that's fine, all legitimate. I don't know. This raises a lot of questions that we think we should look into our laws, and we should look into who's paying taxes and who's avoiding that, at least.
And I think it's also interesting who is put on trial kind of for war crimes in Europe, because I think in 2018, two men who worked for Assad's regime in Syria were put on trial for war crimes in Germany. And so I think it's interesting that, al-Assad has been allowed to kind of quietly slip away. And I wonder, I don't know, maybe Abdul could step in on this, but is this an oversight essentially from kind of the French authorities? Or is it, as we were discussing earlier, they don't want the embarrassment of harbouring a war criminal or to be seen to be sheltering a war criminal? So I wonder which it is, and if that will become apparent.
I think the French authority is really ashamed, because 2 years after landing in France, they awarded him the Legion of Honor. And that's the highest thing you can give to a war criminal or to anybody. And that's because he helped the French authorities he protected French interest from Syrian intelligence. So he was awarded this Legion of Honor. So to award someone Legion of Honor and then after a couple of years put them in prison, that's not really a good picture. And maybe using one of Macron's, officials has his eyes on the property of Rafat al-Assad. He's got very good property.
Well, it's certainly something that's generally slipped past the interest of most of the European news media, hasn't it? There was a piece in Deutsche Welle, but that was about it this week. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. Sorcha, you're up next after this. Listeners, as the news becomes more polarised, it's easy to fall into an echo chamber just when it's more important than ever to be open-minded to other points of view. And that is where The Week magazine comes in. Each week, our editors curate the best of the week's British and international media, presenting you with all sides of the debate so you can make up your own mind on the issues that matter most. And you, podcast listeners, can now get a free trial of The Week magazine. To receive 6 free issues plus free digital access, visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. You won't have to pay anything for 6 weeks and can cancel any time, no strings attached. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code podcast. Okay, Sorcha, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Was this the week that authorities finally lost control of New York's most notorious jail?
Now, following Monday's tour, we heard disturbing descriptions from lawmakers of what they say they saw inside the jail. Inmates remaining in intake centers without being processed for days, stuffed into crowded cells with no masks, while others were confined to shower stalls with no toilets and forced to use plastic bags. Female detainees complained of a lack of feminine hygiene items. They also reported due to medical and correction officer understaffing, inmates were left with untreated open wounds. Many of those on the tour reported feeling in personal danger themselves the entire time.
Lisa Evers reporting for Fox 5 on Wednesday. Sorcha, that doesn't sound like the way a prison should be run.
No, and Rikers Island Jail has been a byword for violence and poor conditions for decades. But actually, the situation has spiraled out of control in recent weeks. An investigation from the New York Times, which was published on Monday, has revealed just how bad things have become. According to their investigation, detainees have essentially free reign inside and have even taken near control of entire units in the building. So the situation, it seems very serious indeed.
And how did this happen? Because Riker Island, the clue's in the name, it's on an island, it's meant to be maximum security, isn't it?
There seem to be several reasons. Firstly, as I said earlier, there have been problems in the jail for decades. It's very badly neglected. There are doors that don't lock properly. The cells have deteriorated, and that's been going on for a while. But in particular, the situation has got so bad over the last probably year. It's because of massive staff shortages. So they simply don't have enough staff to run the jail properly, essentially. And this is partly because of coronavirus. A lot of correction officers were ill with coronavirus and took off time because of that. And then there also seems to have been kind of this spiraling situation where staff are simply not turning up for work. And that was in part due to coronavirus. People were having to pull double or triple shifts in the end because the situation was felt to be so unsafe. More and more correction officers have failed to turn up to work. And so that is largely why the situation has got so serious in recent months.
In a strange sort of way, Arion, this story reminds me of a thing we were discussing last week about the Safa oil tanker, which might just at any point suddenly leak oil into the sea, in that it's been there for years. Sorcha was saying, Rikers Island is a byword. People know that it's badly staffed, badly managed, has lots of problems, is quite violent. It's not like anything new has actually happened here, apart from the New York Times has decided to bring people's attention to it. And you do think, well, this could easily just disappear again. And the reason for that surely is New Yorkers in particular don't care.
Yeah, the prison is already scheduled for closure. The mounting problems have led authorities to go, look, we do need a proper solution to this. And the timetable is that they're planning to have it closed and have another 4 new prisons opened up by 2026, although that seems to be slipping, and now it's apparently meant to be more like 2027. But you're right, it isn't a new problem. I think what is a problem is that everyone seems to be blaming everyone else. Mayor Bill de Blasio says that the problem is prison officers who are apparently faking illnesses or injuries to avoid work. He's also saying that part of the problem is the clogged court system, that we're not getting enough people, because at Rikers, there are people waiting for trial rather than people who have been convicted, although I think there's a part of the prison that is for people who have been convicted, but by and large it's for people who are waiting to attend court. But meanwhile, prison officers say that they're being held back by prison reforms, especially the strict limits that have been put on their ability to use solitary confinement and use even force against the inmates to bring the violence under control. And so in this sort of blame game, there's actually no sort of one clear solution other than closing down the jail and starting up 4 more jails. And even that's controversial with a lot of reformers who say this is just going to outsource the problem to a different area rather than solving the thing itself.
Yeah, and the issue, Abdul, isn't the building. I know Sorcha mentioned, the doors that don't lock, but you can get a locksmith in New York. The issue is the way it's run, isn't it? It's about the will. It's a bit odd that the conclusion should ever be, well, let's shut the building. Of course you can improve the building.
Of course you can improve the building, but I think you need to improve the training of the officers. How much training do officers have? I think it's just 6 months. You enroll in for 6 months and then you become an officer in the United States. 6 months is not really long enough to get anything, to learn pretty much anything, let alone, taking care of people who are maybe most likely suffering from mental health problems. Another problem is the judicial system in the United States. As Arion said, some people are waiting for trial. They don't really need to be there, but they cannot simply afford to pay their bail, which some of it is like $250, $250 US. They cannot really afford to pay it. So they get stuck there. So what do you do if you're stuck in there and your court date is delayed? The prison is overcrowded, short-staffed. You gotta think of the officers as well. They didn't really sign up to face violence. And then the inmates are, facing long times, and most of them maybe are desperate. I was watching an interview with one of them. One of them said he spent more time in jail than outside. So in jail, he feels like home. So he can do whatever he wanted.
And that's where you wonder if there may be change, Sorcha, because it's obvious, isn't it, from us here in the UK and from Abdul in Hong Kong, it's obvious that this is sort of an embarrassment for America. Like, regardless of what New York thinks about it, the principle is innocent until proven guilty. And yes, some of these guys, okay, they might be gang members or whatever, but the specific crime that they're in prison for, they haven't yet been tried for, and they're in a prison that isn't safe. That is an embarrassment for such a wealthy nation.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, most people in Rikers or housed in Rikers are awaiting trial. They haven't been convicted of a crime, and yet they're held in these appalling conditions. New York congressional members visited the jail recently, and they said they saw overflowing lavatories, floors strewn with feces, dead cockroaches, really kind of horror show stuff. And one potential kind of what is being touted as kind of an immediate solution is perhaps releasing all the inmates immediately. That was something that was supported by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Well, releasing them and putting them where?
That's the big question. Obviously, de Blasio has said that it's not possible on kind of public safety grounds. And also, where are we going to put them, these people who are awaiting trial? Something else that is kind of in the works is the Less is More Act, which is essentially looking to kind of reform the New York State's parole system and reduce the likelihood that parolees are incarcerated for essentially what are often really minor violations, like missing an appointment or missing a curfew. So I think the long-term solution, certainly from my perspective, is to simply put less people in jail and stop holding them in these conditions.
I think that's right. I mean, we all know that the US has a major prison problem. Every year, the United States beats out much larger countries like India or China, and also more totalitarian ones such as Russia, for the dubious distinction of having the highest incarceration rate in the world. There's apparently 2.1 million people were in jail in the US last year, and by comparison, China had an estimated prison population that totaled about 1.7 million people. So really, there's this huge problem of just overstuffed prisons and too many of them. And one of the sort of more radical solutions that I suppose Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a representative of is this broad call for decarceration, to try to get people out of prison in the first place. It's not clear entirely how you could find simple solutions for that, because what people tend to call for is, diverting funds to, say, neighborhood services or whatever to try to keep people out of prisons. It's a complex form of solution, but you can't help but feel that something has to be done about the sheer numbers before you can even start to address the quality of prison care people are getting.
And most of those people who are incarcerated are black, aren't they? They're African American. Then you have a lot of Latinos as well. So there's always a racial element, Abdul, to this stuff in America. And, it's no surprise that under Trump, not much was done from that point of view. But do you think under Biden, there is an opportunity now after Black Lives Matter to say, yes, we need to divert more funds into positive engagement with those communities to stop these crimes happening in the first place?
Well, I think it is, as you said, it is the race problem and also classicism. Most of these people are simply poor. They just cannot pay their bail. And under the Biden, what I see that a lot of liberals, a lot of talk, but no, they don't do anything. They just talk about problems and talk about radical solutions. Like AOC said, let's release them all and defund the police. And then, I don't know, it's, I think, a scenario for a new Purge film where you see people purging each other. And if you put it on some kind of stream platform, you might make some money out of it. But this is what the Democrats do. They just talk about things. The more crazy you are, the more likely you would get elected. So they talked a lot about the problems at the borders and the asylum seekers. And then what did they do? We saw pictures of people on horses chasing asylum seekers on the borders and catching them, which is very, very disturbing. So is it going to be better? It doesn't seem so, but they're going to talk about it better because that's what the Democrats do, because they're good at talking better than the Republicans.
I think one of the major problems is that we've got ourselves into a state, not just in New York or the US, but we've got into a position kind of globally where we're happy to accept the idea that people who go to prison suffer a terrible fate. You know, we know that these are places that have terrible facilities. We know that it's a place that you can get beaten up or raped or worse. But we've all come to accept it as part of the punishment. But of course, when you're sentenced to go to jail, the sentence isn't to 10 or 20 years or whatever it is of torment, physical torture. It's to be taken out of the community. And I think one of the problems, and maybe this goes to what Abdul was saying, is that if we expect for people to be put in a violent and dangerous situation and then come out of that place less violent or less capable of doing crime, I think we are sorely mistaken. And that's why reform to the overarching system, you know, and it does need to be more than just talk, as you're saying, Abdul, but why reform to the overall system is important. And we have to stop accepting the idea that we can put prisoners in these awful circumstances and expect good things to come from it.
Sorcha, last word on this. What do you think is going to happen next? I mean, I saw in the article that you sent through from the New York Times, quote, things are unlikely to improve dramatically before the next mayor takes office in January. So what about this short term?
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, what is going to happen next is not much. I think, as Abdul was saying, there will be a lot of talk about the terrible conditions inside, as there has been for months and years. And unfortunately, unless there's kind of wholesale reform of the prison system and of the parole system, which I don't see on the horizon, really, I don't think much is going to happen.
OK, Arion, I'm coming to you next after this. OK, Arion, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that a healthy body doesn't necessarily denote a healthy mind.
This might sound strange, but I've been a professional now 13 years.
Yeah.
And I've been travelling the world to find somebody who can beat me, basically.
Yeah.
And I haven't found them yet in 32 fights. So
Yeah.
for me, I think the mental health problems are bigger than all of it, because it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a kid or anything. It doesn't care.
In the bank, whatever.
I've been unwell all my life.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know what it was, like you said, but I remember having like anxious feelings of being left behind. I didn't know why I was feeling
Pins
this
and
way
needles.
as a little kid,
Yeah.
and all the way growing up as a young teenager, young adult.
Yeah.
But I actually didn't get any diagnosis or anything until I got to like 29 years old. And I just thought it was like a normal thing, like everyone had these ups and downs, and I feel like this because, and some days I feel like, I don't want to live anymore, but I thought like that's normal, but clearly it's not.
Tyson Fury speaking to Frank Bruno for Wow Hydrate last week. You can watch the full interview on YouTube, which I have just done, by the way, and it is great, even though I'm not at all interested in sport. How can it not be interesting with those two personalities? But Arion, what's the story?
Okay, so the sports story is that last weekend, the British heavyweight boxer Tyson Fury, who we just heard speaking, defeated the American Deontay Wilder by technical knockout in the third installment of their trilogy of fights. And his win was impressive in its own right, but perhaps most of all because it was this astonishing return from the rock bottom that he had suffered several years earlier when, by his own admission, he had been going through really serious mental health problems, which led him into a cycle of drinking and overeating and drug use that saw him both balloon physically to nearly 25 stone and sadly even start to contemplate taking his own life, as he was saying in that clip. But in the lead up to the fight and also in its aftermath, particularly on World Mental Health Day, which fell this week, he was just hugely impressive in talking about his own mental health struggles and his hope that his example could help other people find the support that they need.
And Sorcha, it's not just boxing that this is happening in, is it? And it's not just Fury. Other sports stars have been opening up about their mental health recently.
Yeah, the one that immediately comes to mind for me is Simone Biles pulling out 5 out of 6 of her Olympic finals because she said she essentially wanted to prioritise her mental health. And I think it's interesting, actually, that Tyson Fury is rightly being lionised for talking about his poor mental health and how he got treatment, whereas the reaction to Simone Biles was very mixed.
Well, because Americans felt they'd been denied a title. I mean, it's different, isn't it, when you've just won the title and then you say, I'm not feeling great.
Definitely, that's true. But I think, some of the things that were said about her were appalling. I mean, one pundit said that she was selfish, immature, and a sociopath, which, I mean, those are incredibly strong words. And this is someone, don't forget, who is not only probably the best gymnast ever, she's a survivor of sexual abuse from Team USA's doctor. So she's had these huge things to overcome, and she still was top of her game for years. And I think, stepping back for her mental health, I commend her for it.
Well, everyone kind of applauds these people for speaking out, Abdul. I suppose I mean everyone in the media rather than the people that are commentating that Sorcha's alluding to. But is there a danger that actually if the general public relate too readily to the mental health concerns that are being flagged up by elite athletes, it kind of minimises the very serious mental health issues they're talking about? I mean, Bruno has been sectioned. Fury talks in the interview about wanting to kill himself. They are both diagnosed bipolar. Yeah, it's one thing to say, talk openly about your mental health. It's not the same as feeling a little low, is it? These are very extreme circumstances.
These are very different things. And these athletes, as they're in a great place to help themselves because most of them are millionaires. They have the money, they have the capacity, they have access to doctors. While ordinary people like me and you, Olly, if we want to go to find a doctor funded by the NHS, we need to wait months at least. When I wanted to see a doctor when I first arrived in England from Syria, and I was really having some troubles, I had to wait at least weeks. And then I used the magic card that I am a refugee, I come from war zone, and then I got to see one in 3 weeks. But even then, it was new to me. These things we did not learn at school. We don't know how to deal with them. And before the pandemic started, I clearly remember, mental health was something not everyone paid attention to. And even if you say it, not taken seriously. After the pandemic, it has been taken seriously. But again, this is all talk. What are companies doing to support their people? If you go now and say to your company that, hey, listen, I'm suffering from mental health, what would they do? They tell, okay, take 2 days off and come back. And we expect you to do to pick up where you left. So it's great that the athletes have all the support they needed and they're shining light on it. But I really feel bad for poor people who don't have the access.
But maybe this is part of the problem for athletes as well, that, yes, you're right that they have a lot of money to be able to seek treatment, but the thing that's providing the stress in their life is not something that they can take away without losing their livelihood entirely. That what's causing the stress. And I'm amazed by any top-level athlete. I'm astonished that anyone can perform in the cauldron of having 40,000 people watching you play football in a huge stadium or whatever it is.
We've got 40,000 people listening to us now, no pressure.
Oh, that's going to give me real problems. But I do think that maybe the problem is the problem is two things. It's both the fact that they're subjected continually to these pressures in having to perform or else face the wrath of a public, and also that public is much closer to them these days. That, in the sort of contemporary world of modern technology, every single person that they encounter has a camera in their phone, and every single time they finish a match or a bout or whatever it is, they're going to read, potentially, getting into their subconscious is going to be people, the sort of average punter, talking to them via Twitter or social media generally. So I think that there are real particular pressures that the contemporary athlete faces.
Also, Sorcha, it's one thing being a role model for mental health and getting people to open up about that, but they do risk no longer being such an attractive role model for their sport. You can imagine people who are doing amateur boxing, seeing these two guys talking and thinking, okay, I don't want to go professional. This is enough for me. It doesn't look like it really works out well for you long term, this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a core problem with being an elite athlete. I think if you really look into it, it's not actually a very attractive life. Often elite athletes haven't gone to university because they're training, and they can't spend that much time with their family and their friends because they're always at training, and they have these incredible goals and they achieve these incredible feats. But once they've achieved them or they haven't achieved them, then what's left? All your self-worth is really based on kind of achieving these very incredibly difficult and limited goals. And I think when you're looking at, well, what's next? What will I do with my life once I've retired, which comes very early for a lot of athletes, then you're kind of looking at a bit of a bleak picture, unless you're one of the incredibly lucky few who become coaches or media personalities. But the majority that doesn't actually happen to, although it may seem like it from kind of our perspective.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it, Abdul? I was watching Frank Bruno talking about his experiences and how he was saying boxing wasn't the problem because when he was training, he was in the gym every day. It was when that stopped that he had time to kind of catch up with his brain. And I was thinking, yes, but as Sorcha said, that's because there's nothing else in your life apart from the training. That kind of is part of the problem.
Well, this is something that they created themselves. I mean, I'm sure that when you're an athlete, you know that there's certain years that you're going to work for, and you sign up for this. So you can't really have your cake and eat it. You can't really...
We definitely can't have cake.
Yeah, no, unless you're a heavyweight. You can't really demand attention, and then when the attention is gone, complain about it. If you made enough money, and then, well, first you need to have financial advisors around you to invest your money. And then you needed to have good people. And this is something that happens to American boxers more than British boxers. Most of them lose all their money. Like, look at Mike Tyson. He went broke. Now he's back in media, doing a lot of media. And he has a podcast as well. But their career is not very long. But if they are wise and they know how to invest their money, they would live better life than most people. But at least they were playing, doing what they loved. And this is a dream for them. So if they achieve their dream for a couple of years, this is a great life.
I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate a bit, obviously, Arion. The fact that two such masculine men are talking about their mental health problems probably is a shift, isn't it? I guess it's just that, like, for me, I'm like, well, I've heard a million celebrities already talk about their mental health problems. I've heard a million writers talk about it. I've even heard a million footballers talk about it. But actually, if you're the kind of bloke who follows boxing because you aspire to that kind of masculinity, maybe this is the first time that someone quite so manly has talked about these problems so openly.
Yeah, I read an article in The Guardian on Fury and his willingness to talk about mental health issues. And they quoted Dr. Benji Waterstones, who's an NHS psychiatrist who works in London. And he, first of all, pointed out that suicide was the biggest killer of men under 45, which he noted was partly because of men's traditional reluctance to open up. He said what you're saying, and his quote was, "Fury's frankness is redefining outdated ideas of masculinity and what it means to be a strong man." And I think that's really true, that having someone who is the heavyweight champion of the world talk about their struggle with depression and anxiety is particularly useful for a certain class of men. And, to the point about boxers struggling after retirement, or any athlete struggling after retirement, it is particularly acute for boxers, I think partly because they have had this very, very hothouse life prior to the point at which they stop, which has to be quite young for most athletes, but also different for boxers than many other athletes is that their sport is being punched quite literally in the head. So there's real problems that stem from that. And so I think the more that boxing type people can open up about the things that they're experiencing, the more we can try to think about how to address those.
Except it's sort of a vicious cycle, isn't it? Like you were saying, Sorcha, for a lot of athletes, the only career they can really aspire to afterwards is based around media and personality. And yet the only way they're going to get that career is by doing more of that when they're an athlete. And yet doing that when you're an athlete appears to be the problem for a lot of these people. You can't, not everyone can be Andy Murray and just write it out and never try and smile. Yeah, that works for a few dour Scotsmen. But basically, you have to pretend you're having a great time. You have to keep posting to social media. There's pressure there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, these are some of our sports stars, are some of the biggest celebrities in our society. And we always want to think of them as always switched on and always, achieving their goals, always loving life. But that's not the reality. That can't be the reality for anyone, even someone who performs at a really high level. And I do think, athletes need help from, their teams and the organizations that they work with to kind of, plan their next steps in life, plan what they're going to do after. And that actually, I think, should come very early on. That should probably come even, in the teenage years. I know several of my friends, were elite athletes. And that was, when we were 15, 16, you are suddenly faced with the prospect, okay, I, do this and maybe I'll, win a gold medal. Or maybe I'll do this and I won't get anywhere and I will be cut from the team next year. And you're at 15 basically deciding the course of your entire life.
Yeah. I've stopped listening now. Did any of your friends win a gold medal?
No.
Oh.
Most of my friends decided to cut their losses in the end, actually.
Well, that seems an appropriate moment to throw in the towel for this week. Did you see what I just did there? My thanks to Sorcha, Abdul and Arion for their stories. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, by the way, just tap Go To Podcast and then tap Follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.